ready to begin. All right, at this time, today is Tuesday, June 28th, 2022, and this is the Board of Ethics meeting. At this time, I'm going to ask for a calling of the roll.
Chairman Muniz,
Here.
Sasek,
Here.
Wilson,
Here.
Tubin, Jones.
All right. At this time, is there a motion for approval of the agenda?
I will make a motion that we approve the agenda. Second.
All right. Roll.
Sasek,
Here.
Wilson,
Yes.
Wilson,
Yes.
Tubin,
Yes.
Jones, Muniz.
Yes. All right. At this time, we will open the floor for a hearing of the public.
Chair Muniz, I would like to acknowledge that the board, myself, and Attorney Rich Albright did receive a memo from Alyssa Diebold. I believe all of the members have received that. I just wanted to acknowledge that in hearing of the public.
Thank you. All right. Having no other members of the public coming forward, we will now close the hearing of the public. At this time, is there a motion to approve the minutes from our last ethics meeting on March 29th, 2022?
Madam Chair, before we motion to approve the minutes,
Yes, sir.
on page 2 of the minutes under board member comments, if you go down, motion by Board Chair Muniz to dismiss the complaint, that's all fine, and it shows that it was, the motion carried, but it does not indicate who the second was. And I think for clarity, we really need to go back, try and figure out. So I'd like the minutes amended so that the seconder can be added to it, and then the rest of the minutes I felt were fine.
Under which section, I'm sorry?
It's page 2 under board member comments. If you go down, it
Okay.
says board chair, blah, blah, blah. And then it goes motion by board chair Muniz to dismiss the complaint. And then it says motion carried, but it doesn't indicate who seconded the motion, your motion.
Understood.
So we do need to go back and find out who that second was.
All right. So is there a motion to approve the minutes with that change?
I'll make a motion that we approve the minutes with the change. Second.
A second by Mr. Chubbins. Calling of the roll?
Board Member Sasek,
Yes.
Board Member Tubin,
Yes.
Board Member Wilson,
Yes.
Chairperson Muniz.
Yes. All right. We will move forward then to adopt a discussion on updating the bylaws. Would any members of the board like to begin with any concerns or any discussion you would have pertaining to amendments of the bylaws? And we don't have to decide all of this tonight, but we want to at least open the discussion.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
if I may, on page 1 of the bylaws, if we go down to item number 4, meeting quorums, it's just a typo, but my brain caught it while I was reading through everything. And it basically goes to meeting quorum, the board shall meet as frequently as needed to perform it, and it should be its duties, appointed duties, as opposed to perform is appointed duties.
Correct.
And then I had a question about the voting of 3 members of the quorum, but when I actually got into the ordinance, that answered it. So that's the only thing I caught in the bylaws that were any kind of flags for me, and it was just a simple typo.
Okay.
So that's all I have regarding the bylaws.
Okay. Anyone else?
Just a curiosity, I noticed on some, let me pull one up here. Yes, on page 11 or 10.
Are you
subsection-
into the ordinance itself?
Yeah,
Okay, we're gonna go to the ordinance next, right? Yeah, we're
oh,
just,
right,
Yeah.
withhold
yeah,
my
we're gonna,
question.
we're gonna go to the ordinance next. Anything else pertaining to the bylaws? I did have a couple concerns about, the language, particularly in clause 3. And I'd also like us to consider, expanding or giving more detail, to clause 5. But with respect to 3, I just think we could have some language that's a little bit clearer. And I had taken a look at the Planning Commission's bylaws, specifically Section 1 of their bylaws, where it outlines, to me, just with a little more clarity, what membership contains. So one of the things that I thought that, or that I would like to suggest that we consider, is changing the language where it says the Board of Ethics shall consist of 5 members who are city residents, and say appointed by city council, instead of just appointed by the mayor with advice and consent of city council. If you look at the Planning Commission, Section 1, there says the city council shall, by majority of all its members, appoint, and in our case, it would be 5 citizens to serve as members of, and then it would say the Board of Ethics. And then the other clause in there that I would like us to consider adopting is where it says, if a vacancy occurs otherwise than by expiration of term, it shall be filled by appointment of someone suitable to fill the place for the unexpired term. In our current bylaws, number 1, the explanation of the terms is kind of convoluted, but number 2, it says in the event of a vacancy, the mayor shall appoint a member to fill the vacancy for the remainder of the term with the advice and consent of council. And so I would just like to recommend that it just simply say, if a vacancy occurs, otherwise than by expiration of term, it shall be filled by appointment of someone suitable to fill the place for the unexpired term.
It is clear, definitely.
So, and then with respect to clause 5, this will take more than this meeting to explore. But rather than just simply saying the board may adopt and interpret the rules and procedures relating to the requirements of the application of the ordinance, and the board shall conduct its meetings in accordance with the rule of order adopted by city council, I thought it would be good if we more clearly laid out some of the rules of procedure, primarily for future Board of Ethic members who would come on board, be new to it, and really just be able to take a glance at the bylaws and get a clear understanding. And that may help them, even when they later go through a parliamentary procedure course, to be able to apply what they've already read, and make the connection that way. I think I'd like us to think about the future board members who are going to come in and may have an interest in ethics, but might not really understand the rules and procedures of what this board does. And so as much clarity as we could give them, I'd just like to suggest that maybe we add that. But again, that's something that I think would take, I'll admit I feel a little in the weeds with it right now, so it would take a little further investigation. Any thoughts on that?
I do agree with that investigation. I feel that looking at the planning commission and their membership and what you mentioned in the classes, that, yeah, it's more involved and it's easier to understand because it is specific. Ours is rather vague.
Right, right.
I think in regards to section 3, when you compare it to what's outlined within the actual ethics ordinance, a lot of those questions wind up being answered. And again, especially because the ordinance itself does address how members would be replaced in that. So that, that's why it didn't flag it as much for me, because once I got into the meat of the actual ordinance, so we could clean it up, maybe have Mr. Albright just transfer the language from the ordinance to section 3, and that then I think would take care of that.
Yeah, I think as much clarity and consistency as we can have between the bylaws and the ordinance, while we don't want them to be an exact replica, because that's not their job.
Right.
But just at the initial, so yes, Mr. Albright.
Evening's meeting that the bylaws of the Board of Ethics, which were adopted back on June 10th of 2002, they reference old sections of the previous versions of the Code of Ethics and all the sections that provide for the current board that all of you are presently sitting on. Under the old way, if the board members were selected or appointed by the mayor with the advice and consent of the city council, now each council member, including the mayor, each gets to select a member of the board, and then the whole council then votes on that nomination. So that process should, in my opinion, be reflected in the Board of Ethics this evening. And again, it won't be an exact duplicate of what's already in the ordinance, but it can be put in, for lack of a better term, Board of Ethics language that the intent is met. And then that also goes for how appointments are made regarding vacancies. So that's something that can be done relatively easily. Yeah. With regard to the other sections, if I could just add a couple of comments. The Planning Commission just recently went through and revamped its bylaws. The Zoning Board of Appeals did the same thing, and I think it's a good idea to go through, because I think the one member did indicate this is kind of a bare bones bylaws, and it's somewhat older, that it's a good idea to go through it and bring it up to date. For instance, I want to make sure I get the exact language correct. The Local Officers Compensation Commission, they are in the process of also updating their bylaws, and they take a lot of provisions from the actual ordinance and they put it in their bylaws for quick reference, but there are also, with regard to how the officers are selected, that's in the bylaws. Also, the order of business that the board follows. It basically codifies how the agenda is selected, so anybody looking at the bylaws knows that the board is following its bylaws as far as the agenda goes. It references parliamentary procedure. The city council follows the standard code of parliamentary procedure, so that may be a good provision to have in there. The business of this board is conducted pursuant to Michigan's Open Meetings Act. That's another good provision to have in a bylaw. So there are some sections that I would recommend be added to the bylaws. This is something that, taking all of the comments here this evening, I can take all of your concerns, your comments, and put it into a draft form, so the next time you have a meeting, I can circulate that ahead of time. That way you'll have a working copy, and then at the next meeting we can go through and you can scratch out what you don't like and vote on it. You can add what you like, vote on it, and then instruct me to put all of that into a final product that we can, or the board can ultimately vote on.
Thank you, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that would be very, very helpful.
I think that's an excellent idea.
I agree.
So is there a motion in that regard? Well, before a motion, is there any further discussion on the bylaws? And is there a motion in regard to Mr. Albright drafting?
I will make a motion that we ask Mr. Albright to update and bring our bylaws in line with the ordinance and what other commissions and boards are doing within the city.
Is there a second?
I second that update.
All right, calling of the roll?
Board Member Sasek,
Yes.
Board Member Tubman,
Yes.
Chairperson Muniz,
Yes.
Board Member Wilson.
Yes.
All right. So now, on to the discussion on finalizing recommendations for the ethics ordinance. So, Mr. Wilson, you want to start us off?
Well, no, it's just kind of a curiosity, something I'm not getting. I think I noticed it on page 10, instead of a comma, and subsection I was the first place I noticed complaints, alleged violation, city clerks, and it's clerk equal sign S. Is that a typo, or is that a jargon I'm not familiar with?
Oh, I see what you mean.
There's several of them. I don't know if that's,
Yes.
I'd be happy to address that, yeah. It's a typo.
a typo.
There's when, and it's a problem, it's been an ongoing problem unfortunately, but when my office sends one of these documents through, from our office to city administration email, these symbols oftentimes appear. And it's frustrating, but yes, those are unintentional, those are simply typos.
And page 9, section 8, subsection 2, the board shall, however, act upon the receipt of a written complaint alleging violation of this ordinance or on its own volition. Is that language that would allow us to pursue a complaint without a written submission from someone?
If the board was aware of a complaint, the board itself could take it upon itself to essentially have a complaint drawn up, brought before the board, and then discussed and ultimately acted on if appropriate. So it's not limiting just somebody else to, if
Citizen.
a board member or the board itself is aware of something that it believes is a violation of the code of ethics, then it doesn't have to wait for somebody else to bring it. They can do it on its own. The board can do it on its own.
By our own volition.
Mm-hmm.
Very
Own
well.
volition.
Volition, thank you.
I do have a question, a couple questions, Mr. Albright. Subsection, or section 2-102 talks about an ethics ombudsperson. Who is that? Is that you?
I don't believe so. I think that would probably be a conflict of interest for me to
Right.
act also in that
Right.
role. As far as I know, no one has been appointed an ethics ombudsman. So this would be a person who would be appointed by the city manager with the advice and consent of the city council, and they designate an ethics ombudsman for the city. And then, of course, the duties of the ombudsman are contained in other sections of 2.102. I know some colleges have an ombudsman when there's perhaps they're like a go-between between, say, the dean and the student body. If maybe somebody is having some type of disciplinary issue, you go to the ombudsman, and an ombudsman doesn't have an allegiance to the city, doesn't have an allegiance, it's not that person's advocate either. It's more of a person who can kind of sit down with the person, go over what the allegations are, and kind of guide them.
So,
And that's contained in subsection B. So basically, it's setting forth a neutral, like our office, we represent the city council and of course the rest of the city administration, but the client for us is the city council. So the 5 members of the city council, that is our client. An ombudsman, and of course you have city administration. Ombudsman is really not part of the city administration. They're almost like a neutral third party who would look at this ordinance and then give recommendations.
so I guess my question would be, for purposes of actual practice of this body, is this a necessity, or would it be better be placed with 2 things? For us to have a liaison from the city like the other commissions have, where there's a city employee who functions from the city manager's office who functions as a liaison, or even a member of city council that functions as a liaison. And then 2, which will lead to another question I have later on, whether we would be better served to petition council for a line item in the budget for us to have an attorney for those times when there's a conflict of interest, for you to be able to represent or give us legal advice on matters, for example, like what happened with the last complaint that we received.
Well, that's an excellent question. How we see our role, depending on who is coming before this board, who the complainant is, we have to be very, very careful that we're certainly not advocating for a particular side, that we are remaining neutral, and we certainly don't want to give any advice which would appear to favor or that someone could interpret, well, because you said that, the board decided a certain way and resulted in an adverse outcome for that person, okay? So with regard to advising as to preparation of bylaws, that's certainly something I'm comfortable doing. But appearing here before a board when there is a city official that may become before this body based on a complaint, I would recommend, under those circumstances, that outside legal counsel be appointed. Now, here's the thing. That outside legal counsel should also be billing at a rate that is acceptable to the city council who ultimately makes that decision. So again, that is something, that's a rate that needs to be taken into consideration because there are attorneys that work at all different rates and municipal rates as well. And so that's something that certainly should be factored in. But going back to your other question, as far as a liaison goes, I think liaisons are a good thing to have. That way it's keeping the city council in the loop as well. Of course, city administration can still do that. A recommendation could be that the ombudsman, rather than having an ombuds person, is changed to a liaison, or the Board of Ethics could have two different individuals, one who serves as an ombuds person and one person, or a person who acts as a liaison. That'd be another option. And again, these are all suggestions that it's within the board's discretion to make those recommendations to the city council, who would ultimately debate the recommendations and then either decide to adopt them or not adopt them.
Madam Chair, if I may. I am inclined to agree that it should probably be two different people, though, only because, again, the city liaison could wind up in a conflicting issue if things work out, whereas if we have an ombuds person that isn't really linked to the city or one side or the other, it's more appropriate. But I do feel that as a sitting board or commission, there should be a liaison, and that's why I like the idea of two separate entities.
So that leads to another question. Does the ombuds person need to be legal counsel, or does it just need to be a neutral individual that neither works for the city, or, I guess I'm trying to understand where this ombuds person is going to come from?
I would go with the latter. That person does not need to be a licensed lawyer to serve in that capacity. I think it just could be someone who is going to be fair, who's not going to have a particular allegiance to any side, who's going to look much like a judge, that would look at this and not be swayed by either, have an allegiance to either side. Okay, it's going to just look at it, look at the facts, and play it right down the center.
But they would also need to be someone that's well-versed in ethics in order to be able to do that.
I think that's important.
So I guess, hearing that, my concern, because I remember when I first came on, that was one of my first questions, who is the ethics ombuds person? And there wasn't anyone. So, my recommendation, just as a point of discussion, and again, I know we're not making all final decisions tonight, but it would be if we could get some language that revises this section, number one, to put in, for council to, appoint a liaison for us. But then two, for us to be able to seek out and select, or for council to be able to seek out and select, an ethics expert who could function in this role as ombudsperson. And whether or not that would be voluntary or paid would, of course, then be up to council, but, it would need to be, I would want to specify that it be someone who has, a very good understanding of ethics, because otherwise, how can they even advise us? This is talking about them, advising us on opinions with respect to the requirements of the ordinance, and so they need to have a really good understanding of what's required of this board. So are there any other concerns or questions? And then I guess we need to make some motions after that, so.
I have a question, for the appointment of the ombudsman and the liaison person. Would that be something that would be permanent, or is it just as needed? Would they be with us all the time, or we only use them as needed?
The ordinance right now doesn't specify, so that should probably be clarified. So once this appointment is made, how long does that appointment, what's the duration of that appointment? Is it for, a period of, because the person isn't going to be meeting, on a monthly basis. It's gonna be on an as-needed basis. So that appointment could, say, last for a period of 3 or 4 years, as opposed to just being reappointed or a new appointment on an annual basis.
I like the 3-year timeline. It's more in line with every other board and commission. You're appointed for 3-year terms. And that way it doesn't muddy up the waters as to, well, now we have to keep track because our liaison is going to be with us for this period of time, the ombudsman as needed for this period of time, but you still have to, it's harder to keep track of somebody that's not going to be at every single meeting, most likely.
So I would like to make a motion, and I'm hoping I'm following the rules of order in doing this. So you all flag me if I'm not, but I'd like to make a motion that we revisit the ordinance, but in the meantime, that Mr. Albright's office would add specifically to section 2-102, a provision of 3 things. 1, the appointment of a liaison for a term of 3 years. 2, the appointment of an ombudsperson who would be an ethics expert to participate with our board on an as-needed basis, and for their appointment to be for a term of 3 years. And then 3, for the city council to consider the appointment or the identifying an attorney through Mr. Albright that could serve in a capacity when needed to assist this board with questions that might be a conflict of interest for his office if we receive a complaint that that his office could not service because of their commitment to council. And with that, to also establish a fee schedule so that the administration would know the boundaries with which they're looking forward, and for that fee schedule to be a reasonable fee schedule.
I'll second that. No, go ahead, Lynn. You can second it.
Oh, I second that. Thank you.
Okay, calling
I
of
was
the,
busy writing.
calling of the roll.
Chairperson Muniz,
Yes.
Board Member Tobin,
Yes.
Board Member Sasek,
Yes.
Board Member Wilson.
Yes.
Okay. Next discussion is with respect to recording of meetings. Is there any member of the board that would like to start that discussion off?
Madam Chair, if I could. I requested that this be added to our agenda just because there was some confusion after our April meeting. And basically, when I reached out initially, the information I received, because I had asked specifically, where was the recording for that meeting? And the information I got back at the time was it was not recorded because it was requested not to record that meeting. Since then, we've found out that, yes, the meeting was recorded, it just wasn't live streamed. And unfortunately, watching some of what transpired after the meeting, it makes it very difficult when we meet on an as-needed basis. And you've got minutes out there, but the minutes can't be published until we meet and approve the minutes. And here we are now, the end of June, and that was the beginning of April. And a lot of information that came out of that meeting got skewed from what was actually said by this board. And it was being twisted by all parties to make them look better. And that was why I requested, because again, at least if it's being live streamed and it's on YouTube for a period of time, people can go back and actually watch what had transpired in that meeting. Obviously, they're not going to know what went on in closed session, but that's true of every board, commission, and council, and I'm fine with that. But like I said, since then, though, I found out that it was recorded, it just wasn't live streamed, and I believe, Ms. Walton, there were also a couple of FOIAs for the video or something after the fact, so.
That is correct. And we also did provide unofficial records of the minutes. So the minutes were finished after the meeting, and they were news requests for the unofficial record of the minutes prior to them being approved. Because those minutes were finished, they were provided and informed that they were unofficial until this board met and approved those. So the record of the minutes was provided. Anyone that submitted a FOIA for a request of the meeting, that had been provided as well.
So I guess my concern is moving forward, I would much rather see us have recorded live stream meetings just because, again, you know my paranoia. I feel that we're going to have other issues in the future, and I want it to be clear cut right at the onset of what transpired, not second guessing or having people say, well, this is what happened, and somebody else saying this is what happened. So that's all I'm requesting. And that's why I asked for it to be on the agenda. And thank you for getting back with the clarifications. I really did appreciate that. I hope I thanked you in the return email, but if I didn't, thank you.
If I could chime in, I think, one, I believe that it not being left up was on advice of counsel at that time. So, and of course, once counsel advises, we take very seriously, what they advise. And so I'm grateful that, city administration followed their advice. That's what we employ them for. And so if there was a question beyond that, as to why it was not, continued to be displayed publicly, I think people just have to be directed to counsel to get the answer to that. But the other thing is, I think we also have to remember that at the end of the day, what is law, so to speak, is what actually is recorded and approved in the minutes. And so at the end of the day, if anyone goes back and wants to look at the record of what occurred, what they really can only stand on is the recorded minutes that we record and approve. And people are always going to do and say what they want, even if they see it in black and white written on paper. But that's the whole reason why we take the time to write minutes and approve minutes and say, this is it. And let that be, yeah. But even then, that's why we have attorneys like Mr. Albright, because even when it's in black and white written on paper, people will still argue that the facts are different than what you see. So unfortunately, I think that's just, that's a part of life that will always be, but I do, at the same time, I appreciate and understand your concern that that the live streaming be available for the public, even for the sake of transparency.
Well, and this board was taking a lot of heat for following the letter of the law.
Yes.
And I mean, that was just ridiculous. We were doing what we
Due
were
diligence.
charged to do. And again, over the years, I've developed a very thick skin. But the reality is that this board took a lot of unnecessary heat, and we're having a lot of things said about us that did not have an iota of truth to it.
Yeah. And I'm gonna leave that there, yep. All right, any further discussion with respect to, or are there any motions with respect to recording of meetings? All right, hearing none, then we will move to board member comments, and we will begin with Mr. Wilson.
Great meeting, everything nice and concise. No complaints, no comments.
All right, Ms. Tubbins?
No complaints. Thank you, Attorney Albright, for being here and clarifying a lot of that information. We appreciate it, and for your extended help. Thank you.
Mr. Sasek?
I want to also thank Mr. Albright for being here. It always does help when there's somebody that we can really pick the brain of somebody who knows. And I guess I just have a quick question for City Manager Walton. And at the first hearing of the public, you had mentioned how Ms. Diebold had contacted all of us in email. Do we need to be reading any of that into the hearing of the public, or how does that work?
So I acknowledged the receipt of it. All board members had it, and it's a part of the record that she did send information and communication to the board and myself and Attorney Albright.
All right, thank you very much. That's all I have. Everybody have a safe 4th of July.
All right. I realized kind of after the fact that there were some notes that I had pertaining to prior discussions. And so I'm going to say this, not that it's going to change anything that we voted on, but just for the sake of it being on the record. But as we prepare and go back and look at our ordinance and look at our bylaws, just a couple of things that I'd like us to keep in mind is making sure that we give as concise of a picture as possible, not just for our reading, but for those who will come after us, so that there isn't any confusion. And even looking into, training for our commission. Many of us, I think several of us were at the parliamentary procedure training and things like that are offered. So when those options are offered by the city, we should absolutely take advantage of that, and maybe even look at including that, in our bylaws, that people who serve on this board would participate in those types of trainings, just to make sure that they're at all times up to date. And I think there was a mention by Mr. Albright about, adding information about the Open Meetings Act and order of business, and I think those would be great additions as well. To that end, I want to say how much, and I agree with Ms. Tubbins and Mr. Stasek, I appreciate Mr. Albright, I appreciate our city manager, Ms. Walton, and her staff, for you guys walking with us through this process and making sure that we have had all the tools that we needed to make appropriate decisions and to not make decisions that we'd have to come back and remake. So thank you for providing us with the tools. I know that you may have taken some heat even for getting us advice of counsel, but I appreciate that you did not leave us out here making decisions that we would have had to turn around. I hate to have to do redos. I abhor that. So I appreciate you making sure that we were well equipped to make good decisions, and that when it was something that we truly did not have jurisdiction over, that we had the appropriate tools to help us come to that determination. So I just want to say excellent job. Kudos to you all. Thank you so much. Thank you for the hard work you put in behind the scenes, even so that we can come up here and have a meeting and serve our city well in this capacity. So that's all I have. Is there a motion to adjourn?
I motion to adjourn.
I'll second.
All right, calling of the roll?
Board Member Tubman,
Yes.
Board Member Wilson,
Yes.
Board Member Sasek,
Yes.
Chairperson Muniz.
Yes, meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.